Hey everyone, this is going to be the lecture for the central nervous system. If you need this to supplement your note-taking, feel free to jump and skip around. Hopefully the video works well for you. So CNS, the central nervous system. This is very similar to the axial skeleton. We saw axial versus appendicular. This is the central nervous system, and next week we will talk about the peripheral nervous system. So our central nervous system, it includes both the brain and the spinal cord. Now, brain and the spinal cord both have gray and white matter. When we were over in the comfy corner, I lectured to you guys about myelin sheath on the axons, and myelin is very, very fatty. So the question I ask is, what color is fat? Fat is either white or yellow. So what makes white matter white? Myelin, the fat. Gray matter is going to be where the neurons are connecting, and that's going to be most of the thinking that goes on. Our central nervous system is covered in meninges, and these meninges are the protective coverings of the brain. We want to keep the brain nice and safe. Our cranium does a wonderful job doing that, but we also need to make sure that it is bathed in fluid and that it's nice and suspended. So the meninges, this is where it all happens. You can see we've got, oh boy, this is going to be our cerebrum, where we're going to be doing most of the thinking at. And the meninges, we have this little blue layer surrounded by a red layer. So these are going to be the different spaces that allow for our brain to be fed with blood and that allow for the brain to float. So our meninges, and this is going to be specific for the spinal cord. I'll move that video down. We have these all the way around, including our vertebral bones for protection, the epidural space, which is going to be where that loose connective and adipose tissue is going to be, and our cerebral spinal fluid. You may have heard of this before. So the cerebral spinal fluid, this is going to be the fluid that surrounds our brain. So cerebro being brain, and spinal, this is the fluid that is in our brain and surrounding our spinal cord. It flows through the ventricles, and these ventricles are these spaces in between the brain. So we have about 4 ventricles, and these are going to be where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced and then how it flows through. So your brain essentially is suspended, and this is going to be what allows for that kind of mushy matter to all hold together and not be pressed up against. Concussions are when your brain smashes up against one of the corners or sides of your cranium, and so the cerebral spinal fluid is supposed to be there not only for protection but also to allow for the brain to float and be suspended so that there is no pressure pushing up against it and not allowing for it to work. So the fluid is made by the choroid plexus. You really don't need to know that for the test. So our spinal cord. This stretches from the brain to the intervertebral discs, all between the first and second lumbar vertebrae. So it goes all the way down to right above your hips. Here we see these 31 pairs of nerves that kind of jut out in between the vertebrae. And that's when you get a pinched nerve. If one of those vertebrae end up sliding or compressing, that's when you're going to be pinching, literally pinching, that nerve. And the gray matter, this is going to be opposite of the brain. In our brain, we see the gray matter on the outside and the white matter is going to be on the inside. For your spinal cord, it is the exact opposite. We see the gray matter is going to be on the inside and the white matter is going to be on the outside. And that's just some typical structure anatomy. So the spinal cord is responsible for communication between the brain and the body. And it's also very, very important for our reflexes. We saw how tactile reflexes tend to be a whole lot faster than auditory or visual. And that's because it is passing from this sensor in the arm to the spinal cord into the gray matter, which is in the center, all the way to the other arm. So that's where it's going to be connecting. That spinal cord is very important for those interneurons to connect. So the ascending tracts, ascending means to rise, these are going to be the nerves that send information to the brain. So predicting, we're going to have descending tracts that send the information to the effectors. So if I'm stepping down on a nail, the effector is going to be my muscles that are pulling my foot away from the nail. So the sensor, the ascending track, is going to be what tells my brain, you're stepping on a nail, don't do this anymore. And the descending track is going to pull my muscles up so then I don't put all of my weight on the nail. So our brain, gosh, this is still something that we are learning so much about. It seems like every year we come out with more and more information. So during this chapter, you may be trying to pinpoint what regions of the brain do what. You need to know the basics, but you don't need to know super in-depth, this specific region of the brain does that. So we have around 100 billion neurons in there. This is more than our galaxy, that is. So our four main sections, the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The cerebrum, that's going to be all of the orange matter that we have there. The diencephalon is going to be the pink. The brainstem is going to be that green, and the cerebellum is the pinkish. So the cerebrum, this is where we're going to have more of that high animals that are not very intelligent. They don't have much of a cerebrum. The more intelligent the organism is, like dolphins, orcas, the more of a cerebrum they have. The diencephalon is going to be responsible for producing a lot of that sensory information. The brainstem is going to be regulating things like breathing, heart rate, that homeostatic mechanism. And the cerebellum is going to be responsible for muscle coordination and balance. So cerebrum, we've got the right, we got the left. You may have heard that some individuals tend to be more right-brained and others are still more left-brained. There is some research that backs this up, other research that does not. And that is because people are just so naturally complex. It's hard to say you are right-brained because you are still using a significant portion of your left brain to be processing and doing a lot of this work. In general, what we see is that the left brain is a lot more mathematical and the right side of the brain is more spatial oriented and like artsy. So the corpus callosum, this is going to be what connects the two sides. And there have been a lot of interesting cases where the corpus callosum has been cut, and that cut has allowed for people to see something, they recognize what it is, but they can't put the word to that object. And that's because those two sides of the brain are no longer able to communicate with each other. So the visual of seeing this object and the word cup does not make that connection anymore. Other structures we have in here, we have convolutions, which are the ridges, and gyri, which are the bumps. So sulcus and gyri, those are going to be the two big ones that I'm going to want you to know. The gyri, those are the elevations, the bumps, and the sulcus, those are going to be the shallow grooves. So it is a combination of gyri and sulci that make intelligence. The second biology answer that you guys should always know, the first one, structure determines function. Second one is increased surface area is normally a very good thing. The more surface area you have, the more intelligent you are, because that is when you have an increase in grade. Look at people like Albert Einstein. He played the fiddle, and that's actually when he came up with his theory of relativity. And when they studied his brain afterwards, because he's a very intelligent person, we want to that he had an extra sulci or groove in the area that correlated to the fiddle. People that play piano, they have an extra groove over here on their right side. So the more things that you end up mastering and becoming versed in as a child, the more grooves you're going to have, which does directly correlate to more intelligence. So the bigger the brain does not necessarily mean the smarter you are. The more grooves, the more bumps, the more sulci you have, that is when you're going to be more intelligent. And then the fissures, these are those very deep grooves that we see in between the frontal, the parietal. So I just mentioned some. Frontal lobe, we're going to see this right in here. This relates back to the regions of the cranium that we studied a while ago. So the frontal region of the cranium is right here. That's when we see the frontal lobe. We have the parietal lobe. These are going to be the two top ones. And I always think about parietal as your two parents. Two parents, they look down on you. Your two parents are above, and you've got one on here, one on here. You've got the temporal lobes, which are next to your temples. And then in the back, you have the occipital lobe, which once again correlates to the occipital region of the brain. Insula. And the insula is going to be this little region. If you were to pull down the temporal lobe, and I really can't show you, but if you were to pull this back, the insula is going to be a little region back there. And each lobe has its own unique functions on both the right and left-hand sides. So let's get into these. The cerebral cortex, gray matter, this is where a majority of the connecting and critical thinking is happening. So gray matter, we don't have any fat here. This is where a lot of those cell bodies are connecting. We have those multipolar neurons that are coming together and communicating. The inner part of the cerebrum is mainly white matter. This is going to be where we are sending the signal to and from other neurons. So our functions. Frontal lobe is primarily motor coordination, sending out information to the effectors. We have sensor areas, which is the parietal, temporal, occipital lobes, and association areas. We see a lot of this in all of the lobes. So it's very difficult to say that it only happens in the frontal lobe because that's not necessarily true. You do a lot of critical thinking all throughout your cerebrum. So this is going to be a great slide for you when you are making your, model on the paper. The temporal lobe, we see lots of behavior, hearing, memory. Brainstem, this is going to be where the diencephalon, diencephalon's more internal. This is going to be where a lot of the homeostasis is. Cerebellum is balance coordination. Occipital lobe, occipital as in like eyes. So that's vision, parietal is intelligence, language, reading, sensation, frontal lobe, behavior, intelligence, memory, movement. So you may have studied a person named Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker, and he ended up getting a railroad spike through his frontal lobe. And he survived, and everyone was just amazed. He took a railroad spike to the head. But because it went through his frontal lobe, it damaged a lot of his behavior. He became very, very aggressive afterwards. So even though he was still alive, his family and friends said that Phineas Gage, as they knew him, was no longer alive because he was a completely different person. So, diencephalon. This is going to be the internal region of the brain, which is why I have that little blue area lit up. Located in between the two cerebral hemispheres, so in between the right and in between the left. And this is going to contain the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the pineal gland. The pituitary and the pineal gland, those are going to be extremely important for the endocrine system, which we are studying after the holiday. So thalamus and hypothalamus, these are also very important for the endocrine system, which is another system that does communication. Hypothalamus, what I want you guys to know is that hypothalamus with homeostasis. This is going to be regulating a lot of the growth. It's going to be regulating a lot of the metabolism in your body, but not necessarily your heart rate or breathing. That's going to be the brainstem. So functions, thalamus is routing a lot of sensory impulses to the correct region of the cerebrum. So this is once again where a lot of the homeostasis comes from. Hypothalamus, monitoring those internal conditions, monitoring the pH of your blood. Oh boy, the thing froze. Okay, it'll be fine. And then the link between the nervous and endocrine system. The limbic system, this is going to be where a lot of feelings happen. And the cool part about this, the sense of smell is the only one that moves through the limbic system, which is why your sense of smell often has either positive or negative emotions with it. Let's say that your grandma wore a certain perfume and you have very positive emotions with your grandma. So whenever you smell that perfume on a stranger, you associate that positive feeling with them. Your brainstem, this is going to be the last thing I lecture before I put up another video. The brainstem, this is going to be the connection between the spinal cord and the rest of the brain. You do need to know this for your test. Contains midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I'm going to pick up on another video when I'm going to lecture through the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, cerebellum, and everything else.